We're about news, commentary, conversations, truth, liberty, and God. We stand for American values and our flag. We believe that the Constitution is a document that fortifies rights already given to us by our Creator. We will not apologize for our love of God and country, ever. We are Right America Media.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to a special edition of Granite State Live. Today is Tuesday, the 6th day of January, 2026. I'm your host, Keith Hansen, the unapologetic contrarian conservative, and it is great to have you along for this special edition of the program, where we'll be spending our evening discussing a very important and I think equally enlightening topic as well. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We will not be opening the program to calls this evening. However, if you do have a question about tonight's topic, we would encourage you to email us directly, granitestatelive@gmail.com. That's granitestatelive@gmail.com. Put the word property taxes in the subject line. It's a clue about what we're going to be diving into tonight, and the production team will follow up with you on that. Joining us this evening is Ken Eyring. Ken is the past chair of the Windham School Board. He's the co-founder of the Windham Academy Charter School and the co-founder of the Government Integrity Project. Also joining us this evening is a good friend of the program and the second co-founder of the Government Integrity Project, Tom Murray. Tom is also the past vice chair of the Windham School Board and the second co-founder of the Windham Academy Charter School. And finally, we welcome Daniel Richard, good friend of the program, constitutional scholar, founder of the New Hampshire Committee of Safety, and chairman of the National Heritage Center for Constitutional Studies. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you for coming in to talk about this.
Thanks for having us.
I got to say, I've been in New Hampshire since 2015, and I think my time in politics, as much as I have been in Granite State politics here, I don't think I've seen or heard a topic discussed that is more contentious and divisive than education and property taxes. I got to be honest with you, property taxes are skyrocketing. People are putting more and more and more and more money into something that is proven time and time again to be an abject failure. And that is the state of education in the Granite State. So, obviously, we understand what the problem is. We are pouring money into a broken issue. And the answer, it seems, is, well, all we need is just more money. More money will fix everything. If there's enough money, we can get it fixed. But we continue to put money in. The spending is out of control, but we're not getting a return on that investment. What we're getting are test grades that are plummeting. Our kids are stupid. They can open up TikTok. They can open up social media, but they can't read. They can't write. They can't communicate without using AI. They can't balance a checkbook. They're floundering. Yeah, but all we have to do is put more money into it.
Yeah, and that narrative that's famous with the teachers' unions and the school systems, that a little bit more money, we can do better. That is absolutely false. Tom and I served on the Windham School Board, and during my 3 years, the property tax rate went down each year, and scores of our children went up. And in fact, the last year, the test scores for math in 11th grade leaped about 30%. So You just need to have the right people in the position, and you have to have a focus on academics and not on all the other crap that's going on in the school systems.
Yeah, that's right. And then when you look at those test scores, there was a graph that's on the website that we recently launched, which is called SaveOurSchoolsNH.org. And what the graph details is basically, how we are outpacing inflation at an extraordinary amount of money in spending since 2013. And you can see that the kids can't read at grade level, and they also can't, do math at grade level as well. So very concerning.
And it's important, Tom, to note that both you and I are very pro-education.
Oh, extremely.
But at the same time, we want to make sure that parents can afford to put a roof over the heads of their families, that they can put food on the table, and that ultimately our children get the education that they desire. These are the future leaders of our country.
Right.
So we need to find a better way. And the work that you and Dan have done going through the Constitution and the laws is just amazing.
Well, it's really Dan that kind of put the initiative forward as far as like, how do we get here? What's the story? Where do we sit in the timeline? And what was our founding fathers? How did they envision this? How did they envision schools working? Why is it so drastically different than even from when I was in school? I'm not that old. And so that kind of led Dan and I down a path of, just quite frankly, just a lot of investigating and a lot of, research into what happens. And basically, in a nutshell, we have our 1784 Constitution, and it's Part 1, Article 6. That is our education clause, and that's where our founders lay out their envision of how they see the schools. And at that time, most of the schools, all the schools, are religious schools. And then that goes and progresses. The next, the Constitution was changed in 1968. We'll get to that in a minute. But the other clause that was in Part 2 was Part 2, Article 83, and that also lists the duties of the legislators and the magistrates to, quote, cherish education. And we'll talk about that word a little bit more detail as well, because somehow in 1993, we get the infamous Claremont decision where Justice Brock made the usurpation, in my opinion, that the word cherish meant taxation, and this is where we get the whole quote-unquote adequate education. And this is what leads us basically to what that graph shows. It's almost like the demise of public schools as we know it today.
What's interesting is that the Constitution is a restricting document for government.
Limitations.
And the Constitution specifically forbids our government for taxation for the purposes of education. And this is a nugget that Dan discovered just recently.
Yeah, that's great.
So one of the questions, first of all, is, and I hear this word thrown around a lot, adequate. Adequate education, adequacy, the amount of money that the state puts in to guarantee or to oversee the adequate education of kids. What is adequate? How do we determine, and I guess more appropriately, who is determining what is and is not adequate when it comes to educating children?
Well, Dan, do you want to take that question? You want me to?
Sure. I'd like to start with the Claremont decision itself, where the court did what all Supreme Courts throughout the land always do, which is to look at original intent. Because the courts always look at, and that's what the Claremont court said when, in its opinion, it said that we're going to look at this from original construction. And as a scholar and a history buff, that's where I always begin my investigation of any subject matter is, what did the founding fathers say and why? And then you can see these changes throughout time, and then that's how you and I have uncovered how these changes have been done without the consent of the people. And that's really a big deal. And the Claremont court didn't do that. They cited that as their, quote, standard of review, and then ignored the examination of the Bill of Rights first, which is critical to any conversation, right? The state of New Hampshire was created specifically to protect our rights. We had 38 enumerated rights for that reason. And Part 2 is to protect those rights. And that's not what's going on.
So Dan, let me jump in. Let me jump in on that. So what most people don't know, and I didn't know, and Dan brought to my attention, was that New Hampshire has an interesting constitution. We have what's called the bipartite structure, which we're one of only 2 states in the nation that have that style of a constitution, where we have clearly a Bill of Rights in Part 1, and then we have a form of government in Part 2. And rights being greater than government is a really important piece of that, because, see, when you look at that, what I'm going to continue to call a usurpation, because I believe it to be, in Claremont, the 1993 case, they only talk about Part 2, Article 83. They never talk about your rights. See, the legislature can't write laws that are contrary and repugnant to your rights to any part of the Constitution. It's clearly stated in Part 2, Article 5. But most of the laws that are on the books are actually just that. They're contrary and repugnant because they never garnered the consent of the people. Part 1, Article 1 of the Constitution says all government or right originates from the people. It's founded in consent. And that doesn't exist. So the fact that Claremont never addressed Part 1, Article 6, which is the real education clause, in my opinion, leads me to believe that this is something that should be reviewed. There should be a stare decisis challenge, and that's what our intent is to go ahead and do, and put education where it needs to be more prioritized with parental involvement and achievement, because we're not doing that right now. As we obviously stated, the test scores are in the toilet, and our kids aren't getting the education that they deserve. And this whole adequate piece, it's not working. The whole Claremont framework is just not working.
So let me ask you this, and Daniel, you and I have had conversations about this in the past, but I don't think that I had mentioned this specifically to you. This past summer, I was asked to give a Second Amendment update to the Liberty Caucus for the New Hampshire House. There were 32 or 33 elected state representatives in that room. I held up a copy of Black's Law Dictionary, and I only had one person out of 32 or 33 lawmakers that could explain the difference between Black's Law Dictionary and Webster's.
Wow.
And I said, this is actually pretty terrifying, because you people are responsible for using this, a pen, to write laws that other people are going to enforce at the barrel of a gun. You need to understand the difference between a colloquial definition as found in Webster and a legal definition as found in Black's Law. So the question that I have, and of course, adequate education, you would expect that people would understand the difference between a colloquial everyday definition and a legal definition, which does not change despite tendencies and social pressure and so on and so forth. So the question that I have is, when we look at adequate education, not from a colloquial defined standpoint, but from a legal definition, what is the legal definition of adequacy when it comes to education, and who is responsible for ensuring that the education that is being provided to young people today actually meets the standard of adequate?
Well, that's up to the parents, right? That's what Article 6 was all about, the reservation of the private right of the parents to decide what curriculum beyond what was detailed in Article 83, and more importantly was the morality clause. Who is going to decide what is moral and what is not moral? And that's what we struggle with today, is that government now decides what is right and wrong.
And the state never had that authority, and it still doesn't have that authority.
And Tom, you brought up earlier this morning when we were having a conversation that adequacy is not in the Constitution.
It's not defined.
It was brought up as part of Claremont.
It is not a textual. You won't find it anywhere in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a whole series.
And the danger of that is that people then focus on what is adequate as opposed to what's constitutional, what's allowed by law.
That's right.
So the whole conversation, we're not talking about, we're not focused on the bullseye.
Ken, there's a series out there that Paul and Bretson did, and he had multiple speakers. Rick Lehman was on there. Bob Geida was on there. Greg Sorg. The one with Rick Lehman on it was great. And he speaks to this exact point of the adequacy, and it's not there. It's not in the text.
And just to give some context to Rick Lehman, he's the counsel for the New Hampshire Senate.
That's correct.
So I'd like to get, if we can, our producer to get that graph up one more time, because I want to. I just want to have this in the background while I pose a question. So we're looking at reading scores that are plummeting. We're looking at math scores that are plummeting. We're looking at spending, which is significantly outpacing inflation. So these outcomes, reading outcomes, math outcomes, basic proficiency, basic skills, this is a policy failure, I think, absolutely. But can we look at this, and can this serve as an indictment of the Claremont framework itself, talking about adequacy? Is it a failure of this legal concept of adequacy beyond just a policy failure?
This is an indictment on the whole entire system. I mean, just recently, look what happened in Claremont. Again, notice we talk about Claremont quite a bit. They were on the verge of shutting schools down over funding issues. But then when you take a look at their test scores, they're horrific. And I can't understand, like, who in their right mind, if you're a businessman,
Right.
would want to fund a failing operation where you see the kids' ability to achieve continue year after year after year to go down, and yet the price continue after year to go up.
And that's part of the problem. We're as parents, we're taxed. That money we have no control over. They give it to the school systems, and they educate our children. But
Right.
in the end, our children are not being educated,
No.
and as parents, we're being left out of the process. That's one of the reasons why Save Our Schools New Hampshire was founded, so that we can get back control of our children's education. It's save our schools, save our children. It's very important. It's more for the future of our country.
So 32 years later, if the Claremont decision, based upon all of this information today, were to be decided today, not in 93, do you think the outcome would be the same?
Well,
I don't.
I know that we would all be chiming in and making sure that the state as a whole would be aware of these issues that have been uncovered, and that our constitutional rights have been usurped, as Tom has mentioned a couple of times.
I don't believe it would be decided the same way, and the reason why is because there's a four-factor part test. It's the Ford test that the Supreme Court uses when they talk about workability, and I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, as to how Claremont is the judicial review that they use, how Claremont is not workable. It's not. And just by the basis of what you're seeing in the outcomes. Recently, this past summer in July, they came out with a Convail case where they just arbitrarily increased the amount of money, but there's no conversation about adequacy. The judiciary, in my opinion, is really crossing a line when it comes to Part 1, Article 37, where we're talking about separation of powers, where they're almost dictating to the legislature what to do. But what nobody's doing is no one's actually looking at what's the constitutional basis for any of this in the first place.
Right.
And that's why a lot of this stuff is just void ab initio, meaning void from the beginning, because they don't have the constitutional consent to be doing this. And when you look at that 1968 amendment specifically, read Part 1, Article 6, prior to the change in 1968. And what you'll clearly see is that there is a clause that gives the legislature authority. It's an empowerment clause. And they're empowered to authorize. That's it. They're empowered to authorize 4 bodies: parishes, bodies corporate, towns, parishes, bodies corporate, and religious societies. In that amendment, those 4 entities were authorized to do what? To make adequate provision for public schools.
But let's also talk about their ability to tax and what are the purposes for them to tax.
The taxing clause is in Part 2, Article 5, and it only states that the original 1784 early state papers only allowed them to tax your property state taxes. We've had many amendments.
For the use of what?
For the use of government itself, which schools are not government, unless someone wants to say that we have government schools, which that would be interesting. It's the preservation of the inhabitants thereof, and it's the defense of the state. Those are the only three purposes that are listed in Part 2, Article 5. Subsequent to that, we've gotten the highway tax, we've gotten the inheritance tax, we've gotten
the education tax through the
that was in 1990. That was the last one. That was a lottery tax, though. That is not on your property tax, not on your estate.
That's right.
That is 100% restricted to lottery proceeds only. It's the amount of money that the lottery raises minus their expenses can go towards educational aid. That does not authorize them to tax your estate. The swept tax is unconstitutional.
What is the swept tax?
The statewide education property tax. That comes out of Claremont. That is 1997 Claremont 2 is what people refer to it as. That is 100% unconstitutional. The state has never had that authority. And moreover, in 1968, the state's empowerment clause was removed. And they also struck towns, and this is where towns lost their ability to tax for the purposes of education. They had it. They had it from 1784 all the way up until 1968, but the text is clear. It was removed. The empowerment clause, gone, and the authorization of towns, gone.
Tom,
extinguished.
You read something to me this morning from the Constitution that specifically, the wording specifically prohibits taxation for education. Is that quick for you to call up?
Yeah, that's Part 2, Article 83. And Dan, correct me if I'm wrong on this. This is where there's a change. Our Constitution, as you read it on the website, is incorrect. And whether that be through OCR technology, but it talks about that no taxation should be raised for the purposes of education, and it says
or institutions
of religious institutions. I don't have it in front of me.
You have that, Dan?
But it's or versus of.
Yeah, no, it's a really big deal. You know, to really wrap your head around the subject matter, I always like to start with what is the public benefit? Why exactly is there any involvement with the government with education? And many times when you speak to people who don't know the answer, they'll tell you that it's for making sure that our kids have the ability to prosper in life, that it'll be a blessing to all of us if everyone is able to earn a good living once they leave school. And that's not correct at all. The government should have no involvement in who wins and who loses. In fact, it was based on the very first sentence in Article 6 says very clearly, as morality and piety, rightly grounded on evangelical principles, will give the best and greatest security to government, and it will lay in the hearts of men the strongest obligation of due subjection. That's the whole purpose in 1784 as to why the education clause was written the way it does. And it goes on to cover that in a lot of additional details, but the backstory goes from there. So I say to people, who decides morality, right? Is that decided by the parents, or should that be decided by government? And today we have government deciding that very issue because they modified that word evangelical. The word evangelical, which means biblical principles. In other words, they wanted children to learn in school what moral values should be based on. And it should be based on, remember, the Bible was 1,700 years old when this document was written. Today it's 2,000 years old. And so instead of following biblical principles, we now have the government deciding what is right, what is wrong. And this leads to all the chaos that we're living with. And, you know, it's just a nightmare.
I think one of the big problems here, and I think the easiest way to really frame this, if you remember the original movie Ghostbusters, when they were talking about taking out loans to fund their Ghostbuster business, and Dan Aykroyd was having a conversation, his character was having a conversation with Bill Murray's character, and Dan Aykroyd's character says to Bill Murray's character, "You don't know what it's like out there. I've worked in the private sector. They expect results." And I think this is perfect. Within the public sector, there's no metric of success. What is the metric of success with public schools? Moreover, what is the metric of success with a private school? I have 2 stepchildren. My 2 stepchildren go to a private school. For approximately $7,000 a year, they are able to provide a pretty damn adequate education. These kids are smart, they are eloquent, they can read, they can do complex math. I'm looking at math problems that 7th graders are doing going, wow, that's far more advanced than what I was doing when I was in 7th grade. There is a metric of success in the private school world, because if you suck, you get eliminated. The parents pull their kids out of the school. If they're talking about woke ideology and they're focusing on everything other than the education, the parents have the right to say, nope, I'm not putting money into this educational body. I'm pulling my kids out. The school doesn't have the resources. It folds. It goes away. But we don't have that performance metric in the public education system. All we have are politicians who figured out how to enrich themselves by never fixing a problem, but screaming, all we need is more money, and we're going to be able to fix it. I think, quite frankly, it's bullshit. I think the people are tired of funding a broken system. There needs to be a remedy. There needs to be a remedy yesterday, and the people need to have an opportunity to opt out of this crap and stop funding this garbage. Because I, as a property owner, am tired of putting thousands of dollars into an education system that couldn't find its way out of a phone booth with a damned map.
And Keith, the worst part of it is that you pay that private school and then you're still forced to finance the government indoctrination center.
On top of the property taxes, which are pushing $10,000 a year. Exactly. Now it's two $7,000+ per year, so $15,000 in tuition to a private school, plus 70%, give or minus a couple of points, 70% of that $10,000, so $7,000 of that. So basically, I'm putting somebody else's kid through a year of private education. That's what it's tantamount to.
Except their kid isn't getting the education that your children are getting.
Yeah,
and
they're getting the education,
and the cost of their education is closer to $20,000 a year.
And I remember going back to 2017 when Andrew Volinsky was doing it was basically a cover for trying to get an income tax and additional taxes here in the state, but the adequacy of education. And I'm looking at the numbers: 16,000. Of course, this is going back 2017, 2018. $17,000, $18,000, $21,000 to educate a kid. It's amazing, right? Because the private schools can do that for $7,000, $8,000, $10,000, a fraction, a half of what the public schools are demanding, and they're actually putting out product. They're putting out kids that can read, kids that can do math, that are matriculating on to higher education, or that are choosing trades and going on to become very successful young adults at a young age. Not floundering morons who can only open up a phone and access a social media app. It's absolutely outrageous. But the problem, going back to the definitions, is that these laws and the Constitution are written using Black's law definitions, not Merriam-Webster. So the average person doesn't understand any of this.
Yeah,
this is well beyond the comprehension of the average taxpayer.
And that's why recent Supreme Court decisions are key here.
Because,
because our Constitution should be read in the definitions and the
interpretation should be read usage and
of
custom.
The customs and usage at the time they were written.
Right, and that's why, Ken, not to jump in, but that's why you see cases like Espinoza versus Montana and Carson versus Macon, 2022. Now those have set that exact precedent of what you're speaking to. But, it's interesting, Keith. You mentioned
just to highlight that, Tom, not to cut you off. The Constitution is not a living, breathing document.
No.
As society determines, the definition of words have changed over time. That's not how you reinterpret the Constitution.
No, I think Amul Thapor actually has a really good quote. When he was, Amul Thapor was actually considered for the Supreme Court in the United States at one point, and in his explanation of originalism, because I think that's what you're talking about, is he talks about a contract with the neighbor and it's saying, would you want the words to be what it meant, or would you want me to redefine things? He's like, well, of course I would want the contract to say what the words to mean. He goes, well, you're an originalist too. So the Constitution's a contract, and the contract's pretty clear in the text of the contract of what it says. But Keith, you mentioned a thing that kind of resonated with me, and that is you're spending half, and that is actually validated. I think is Academy for Science and Design.
Right.
I think that's
at the time that we were founders of the Wyndham Academy. I think they were getting about $5,500 a year. They were the #1 ranked school in the state.
yeah.
So how is it that you can produce outstanding results? I mean, I know the answer, but I mean, I'm putting that out there for the sake of argument.
Right.
Why can't the public schools generate? I mean, if you can do that for $5,500, man, imagine what you could do if you had $17,000 or $18,000. Yet the entities that are getting $17,000 or $18,000 are saying, well, we don't have enough money. The teachers have to go out and buy their own arts and crafts supplies. Yeah. But geez, there's plenty of superintendents and deputy superintendents that are out there making six-figure salaries, really, really fat pensions, and really, really great healthcare benefits. Your tax dollars are going to pay for the administration salaries and the benefits for those administrators, not for the schools, not for the teachers, and certainly not for the kids. Prove to me that I'm wrong.
No, a little fun fact for you, Keith. When Ken and I served on the Wyndham School Board, we had 246 teachers. Over 140 of them had six-figure packages for a 184-day contract.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny you saying that, because as you're saying that, I'm thinking, and they also have 3 months off.
That's right.
Or 2.5 months off. Yeah. What a fantastic job if you can get it.
To get into the weeds, you should see the amount of earned time, sick time, bereavement time, vacation time. It goes on and on. It's astounding when you actually break it right down and see what you're paying for.
So what can people do? Because I mean, to me,
that's the question.
It should be an opportunity to opt out.
That's why we're here.
That's why we're here. People can file a tax abatement. So on our website, saveourschoolsnh.org, we have a tax abatement section. We have a little explainer video that shows people how to fill out the tax abatement. They have till March 1st of this current year to file for an abatement. There's an attachment A that goes along with the abatement. The video explains how to fill everything out, and they can simply file that with their assessor's office. And what that will do is that will reserve their rights to go ahead and challenge the unconstitutional statewide education property tax, the SWEPT, as well as the local portion of the education tax. And our goal is to get this constitutional question laid down in front of a Superior Court judge and bring it all the way to the New Hampshire Supreme Court and beyond if we have to, and just challenging the constitutionality of these education taxes.
Right. And I just want to emphasize what we stated at the beginning. We're not anti-education.
That is
very,
absolutely
very,
correct.
very pro.
Just the opposite is true.
Absolutely. We want our children to be educated and so that they have the ability to realize their potential, each individual
That's exactly
student.
correct.
Right.
So this is a legal means of saying this is not tax evasion.
No,
first
not
of
at
all,
all.
this is saying what the town needs to be able to provide adequate services, highway department, police department, fire department, medic, everything else, town services, those taxes remain intact. But the abatement is seeking solely to rebate the amount of money paid through municipal property taxes that would be earmarked specifically for public education means.
Which is
100%
typically
correct.
70 to 75% of each
Your tax bill.
each property's tax bill.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the obvious question here, which is if, and this will certainly be challenged, and this would be a fantastic opportunity to see how this would be interpreted and applied, certainly in the courts, the appellate courts, and beyond. That being said, if people en masse started to do this, this would create an absolute crisis for the public education system. Not that I'm saying it shouldn't, because I think that they should more than just having their hands slapped. But this is going to create an interesting situation that I actually think would be beneficial for the charter schools and the private schools, because it creates an opportunity and a marketplace for educational alternatives, including homeschooling. Because if people don't like what they're getting, it's going to force them to look into alternate educational sources for their children.
And it also creates competition.
Competition.
And
Took
that-
the words out of my mouth.
And that is what needs to happen, because there is no competition.
Right. Right.
As a capitalist, I would never, ever, ever be in favor of a public-private partnership because it eliminates competition. But this isn't even a public-private partnership. This isn't elimination of competition. This is an outright monopoly.
That's exactly right.
That's exactly
It's
right.
violating the monopoly clause
You
of
took
the
the word
state
out of my mouth.
constitution, Article 83. Yeah.
Correct.
And the worst part about all of this, gentlemen, is that we're dealing with all of these changes where we have no one is educated. We spend all this money, but no one has been taught the fundamentals of the state constitution. Our legislature has not had an education in the state constitution. Our judiciary hasn't had none of them have any academic background. Most of them have been taught about the U.S. Constitution in law school, but that's it. And then society in general. And this is a recurring theme. Benjamin Franklin famously said, when asked what type of government we have, said one of the locals asked him, and his famous response was, "You have a republic if you can keep it." And this is where my efforts have been about trying to resurrect the fundamentals, for us to go back and understand how far we've deviated from the fact that government's supposed to do three things for us: protect life, liberty, and property. Education is up to the parents. It's up to the parents to choose who is going to educate their child. It's up to the parents who and how much they're going to pay for that. And so we've left that paradigm so that now we have well-intended people most of the time. I'll give everyone, the benefit of the doubt here, but the point is you have ill-informed, poorly educated people making decisions about our family and our lives that cause all this chaos.
Dan, I just gave you an instance where 30-something lawmakers couldn't tell the difference, couldn't articulate the difference between a colloquial dictionary and a legal dictionary. So you want to talk about legal and procedural and administrative and civic illiteracy? Boom. There you go. People who are running for office, we talk about, there should be a citizenship test. There should be a citizenship as a test and a political test and an administrative test and a legal language test for people who want to serve as one of the 400, which is ridiculous, members of the state house. This to me is inexcusable, and it's been allowed to take place because of the illiteracy of the population, because they don't demand more. An educated population would stand up and say, "This is ridiculous, we want accountability." But when you can't understand the language, how can you possibly understand what's at stake, what's happening, compare and contrast what you're getting versus what you should be getting, and understand where the deficiencies lie?
That's right.
You can only force a bad agenda on the people of a society if you keep them ignorant of the fundamentals.
Right. You don't know your rights. You can't protect your rights if you don't know what they are.
I have to chuckle here because at some point the four of us are going to be labeled the four horsemen of the New Hampshire educational apocalypse. If this is, I'm not going to say allowed to stand, because it's everything that I have seen on this. It is. You are using existing statute and you are using the state constitution to establish the rights of the citizens.
That's right.
And if this gathers steam, this is going to be absolutely game-changing for the state. And I think, initially things always get worse before they get better. This is going to create a vacuum, but I think the end result of this is going to be significantly superior to anything that we have seen because, again, we're going to have that competition. We're going to have options for parents, and we're not going to have people who are forced literally at gunpoint or property seizure to put money into a system that is simply a black hole.
And that's a win for our children.
100%.
And by the way, the money aspect of all of this is one of the things I pointed out to Ken and Tom, and that is that in 1784, there were only two taxes. You had a property tax and a poll tax. And along the way, the state constitution precludes creating any new methods of taxation without the consent of the voters. And that would happen 4 more times. We would get the first change in 1903, where the people would approve an inheritance tax. Next was the road tax in 1938, followed by the timber tax in 1942, and then current use tax and the lottery tax. Guess what I didn't mention? I didn't mention schools, did I?
No,
Why?
it's not
Because
there.
there's never been any provision in the Constitution. The word cherish does not mean taxation. And you can't just come out of, try to convince the society that for 200 years that there's been no constitutional mandate for the state to involve itself in the education of our children. And really the turnabout comes to us in the 1960s, where the U.S. Supreme Court would ultimately rule on separation of church and state and eliminate the ability for morality based on evangelical principles to be taught in school, which would lead to the amendment in 1968 of Part 1, Article 6 that Tom and I keep referencing.
So, Tom, I want to ask you, what do you see as a logical progression of this and outcomes? Obviously, people are going to do this. It's going to wind up in court. So let's start from there. People file this abatement. It's likely at that point that the town, the municipality that those people live in, to whom they file this abatement document, they're not going to recognize what this is. They're not going to understand it. They're going to deny it.
Right. That's exactly
so what happens
right.
then?
So they're going to deny it, and then it's going to get appealed to the selectmen. They're not going to understand it as well, which they'll deny it as well. Or they just won't even address it, and then it will expire on July 1st of this year. And then at that point, you have a choice. You can either take it to the BTLA, or you can take it to Superior Court. I'm encouraging people to take it to Superior Court. The reason why is because that's the appropriate venue, whereas the BTLA talks more about proportionality and taxes.
And just for the benefit of for people who are not familiar with that acronym, BTLA.
Bureau of Tax Land Assessment. I don't quote me on that, but okay. I've always just known it as BTLA.
Okay.
But it's an entity that was created by the legislature to handle a lot of these tax cases.
Tom, let me just jump in real quick. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
But it's important to know that that's one of the reasons why we have this organization. People will get overwhelmed thinking, I can't do this on my own. That's why we're here. We want to help everybody through this process, and that's why they need to reach out to us.
So is the goal an influx of cases in Superior Court that would ultimately get kicked up to potentially the state Supreme Court and have the
Correct.
state Supreme Court rule? Because, I could see the state Supreme Court saying, this is ridiculous, you don't have standing, go away. I could
Everybody
see...
has standing.
Everyone
I could see... Well, everybody has standing, but ask Daniel Richard about, the court's not recognizing standing.
So that's a great question. That's the reason why we did this, okay? So we specifically targeted RSA 7616 because for two purposes. Number one, you're coming as a taxpayer. So I think it's important to note to the audience that's watching that nobody has ever challenged or made a stare decisis challenge of Claremont. Nobody. This will be the first time that we're going to be doing this.
What is the stare decisis?
It's basically it's a legal review, and it's to say that the judiciary in '93 got it wrong. I mean, we had the whole Dobbs-Jackson case that was just overturned, okay? And they got it wrong. Judges make mistakes too. It's fair to say. So that's the end goal. How do we get there, though, to answer your question? So we go from the local part, and then as of July 1st, we get to go to Superior Court. That's where we lay down the constitutional question. It's RSA 491:22. We have an attachment form that has been filled out. You just have to sign that. The lawyers did all the legalese behind that. And that's where we get in front of a Superior Court judge, and we lay down that constitutional question and say, show us. Where do you have the authority? And so whatever decision we're prepared to challenge, if it's not in our favor, to the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And then at that point, I'm quite honestly, I don't know where it's going to go if it gets to the Supreme Court level, because keep in mind, we have some changes to the judiciary. Marconi is going to be moving on, and so there'll be a replacement there. And obviously, I think Justice Bassett was aged out, so I think his replacement's coming along if they already haven't made that. So it'll be interesting to see what Kelly Ayotte does to nominate and the Executive Council does as far as putting a potential constitutionalist, a textualist on the bench. So,
what kind of lobbying efforts would you expect from the New Hampshire teachers unions?
Oh, I think they're
That would
going to
be brutal.
Brutal, yeah. And keep in mind, this is a case that has a lot of federal arguments that go along with it. that makes it a really interesting case to get all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States if certiorari is granted.
This is not a battle, though, between our organization and the teachers' unions. We really want to lay the foundation for a proper education to be presented to our children.
And I think, Ken, that needs to be the highlight.
We would love to work with the teachers' unions as part of that, but I believe when I say brutal, I believe that they'll misinterpret our
Tensions.
our intentions, and then literally go to war. But I think that we should join forces so that educators can actually provide excellent education for our children.
Yeah,
It's a win-win for
we're in
everybody.
support of the teachers, perhaps not support of the teachers' unions.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think, if the teachers aren't working for a public school, those who are actually good at what they do could very
Great at what
easily
they do.
move on to a private school. They could move on to a charter academy. They could,
Right.
they could move on to an educational co-op. It's not targeting the teachers. It's targeting the system that uses the teachers and continues to burn money. I think one of the most important things here, and I would recommend, if you haven't already thought about this, would be to take this. The three of you guys, I'm happy to moderate the discussion, but this is something that should be done, I think, in the community. I think we should go throughout the state of New Hampshire. We should have public forums. We should explain this to people. We should expose these concepts. We should give these forms out to people, let them ask questions, and encourage and empower people to do this in their respective towns and cities. I think this could be a very, very powerful movement if it was mobilized and marketed properly.
I agree.
Absolutely. And let me interject real quick. I'll be having a meeting on the 25th at 25th of the month to cover Article 6, Part 1 at Macris Steak and Lobster House between 1 and 3 o'clock, if anyone wants to join me to get a greater breakdown on what we're talking about.
All right, and all the lobsters on you, right, Daniel?
Sure.
All right, sounds good. All right, folks, that is going to do it for our special edition of Granite State Live this evening, Tuesday, the 6th day of January 2026. Again, if you have any questions about anything that was discussed tonight, we would encourage you to send an email, granitestatelive@gmail.com. That's granitestatelive@gmail.com. Also, check out the website, saveourschoolsnh.org. That's saveourschoolsnh.org. And I want to give a special thanks to our guests this evening, Ken Eyring, Tom Murray, and Daniel Richard. Gentlemen, great job on this. Outstanding research. And we're going to make it a point to get this out and start having the conversations in the communities about this important topic. And I think absolutely this can be changed. Education in the state of New Hampshire can be saved. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's going to do it again for this week's edition of Granite State Live, albeit abbreviated. We do appreciate your tuning in. GraniteStateLive@gmail.com. That's GraniteStateLive@gmail.com. And remember, be nice to one another. Civility does work. God bless everybody.
We're about news, commentary, conversations, truth, liberty, and God. We stand for American values and our flag. We believe that the Constitution is a document that fortifies rights already given to us by our Creator. We will not apologize for our love of God and country, ever. We are Right America Media.